You're listening to episode 131 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Dr. Joe Loizzo of the Nalanda Institute for Contemplative Science speaks with us about his new book, Sustainable Happiness, The Mind Science of Well-Being, Altruism, and Inspiration. One of the things we struggle with is this notion of the scientific validation for contemplative practice. We do see studies that have interesting and sometimes compelling, if not conclusive, results to show that meditation may have greater benefits than just relaxation. And our application of modern scientific methods is very early in the development of ways to consistently measure subjective experience. Because it's all not firmly nailed down in exacting detail, however, doesn't mean we should immediately stop our practice. Studies can confirm a biological validity to what we're experiencing, and brain scans can indicate wonderful new avenues for therapeutic applications previously unconsidered. And we can still keep practicing, as has been done for thousands of years, while we learn more about what's going on in our minds. Joe Loizzo, MD, PhD, is a psychotherapist and founder of the Nalanda Institute for Contemplative Science, a contemplative learning community that teaches timeless tools of self-healing and interdependence for today's complex world. On faculty at the Weill Cornell Center for Integrative Medicine and Columbia University Center for Buddhist Studies, Dr. Loizzo lectures widely on the role of contemplative science in the future of health, education, and contemporary life, and teaches regular public classes and workshops through Nalanda Institute and Tibet House, U.S. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice Garanza Estate organic tea. And our guest today is Dr. Joe Loizzo. Joe, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Ted.
So what we wanted to talk about today is you have a new book that's just come out on sustainable happiness. But first, I'd like you to talk about your background and how you first encountered Buddhism and meditation and that kind of practice and where that's taken you.
Right. Okay, well, it seems like going an awful long way back, but I think my interest really does date to my family background, because my father was a psychiatrist, or who initially, my mom and my dad had sort of a different worldview. She was spiritual, from a sort of traditional Italian background, but a very quiet kind of Catholic spirituality, and he was raised in that culture, but then sort of rebelled and became a doctor, and sort of went more into the science side of life, and so I was always fascinated by the intersection, or the lack thereof, or the conflict between spirituality and science, and particularly, it seemed to me that the place where they most intersect is in the realm of psychological healing, psychotherapy, the mind-body kind of world. So I was always fascinated, and at the same time I saw my dad, as he sort of moved further and further away from his spiritual roots, I saw him get more and more stressed. And even though I really admired what he did, because he had a talking therapy practice, and I used to see people coming and going out of the house and thought how cool he would just sit and talk to them, I also saw as a person that he, was burdened by everything he was doing for others, and wasn't necessarily growing and healing. And so I sort of made a vow to myself that I wouldn't go, sort of out on a limb in that way. I would try to integrate the what I liked and saw as a really wonderful way to live, to sort of help people, to dialogue with them, with sort of a lively and a real integration of spirituality and contemplation. But when I went to college, so I actually went to a Catholic boys' school and survived it. It was really wonderful school, actually, and got me interested in existential psychology and philosophy and fun things. And I went to Amherst actually with the interest, sort of carrying my little copy of Jung's, Psyche and Symbol and, A Modern Man in Search of a Soul and so on. I went to Amherst and in my first religion class, because I was really interested in trying to bring these worlds together, I met Bob Thurman, who actually was doing his first year teaching after just coming back from, sort of having dropped out of being a monk, and getting his PhD. And so there was this world of Tibetan Buddhism that he was laying out, which is something that Jung was very interested in. But instead of just being something, exotic that Jung had written a few things about, here it was in a very live, sort of a living and vibrant and complete way. And so I was fascinated because especially the Tibetan way of integrating spirituality and meditation with a kind of interest in the science of healing and sort of science of the natural world, really seemed a way to bring all the things that I felt were sort of fragmented or in conflict in my home and my childhood, to bring them together, and seemed to promise a way for me personally to be able to sort of have my cake and eat it too, to be able to practice in a secular way within the medical scientific world, and yet also have this access to a living contemplative tradition that could sort of help me deal with the stresses and strains and grow as a person while I was doing it, but also potentially be really helpful to others and allow me to sort of, provide alternatives to the traditional therapy and also traditional sort of medication approaches.
It's interesting you talking about the contrast between your parents and their approaches, and often those in the scientific community are characterized as being separate from those personal uplifting emotions that we have. Did you find that was partially true, at least for your father, and that at least in you that was balanced by your mother's way of engaging with life?
I do. I mean, I don't know whether it was karma or accident or some kind of psychological conditioning or whatever. But my father was not as positive, cheerful. He just didn't seem to be as satisfied, as rewarded, and as positive a person. And I think that just on a visceral level made me feel like, gee, I don't know if that's the way I want to follow entirely. And my mother certainly, I think, somehow she grew up in Sicily in a very sort of simple world, but somehow in that context she never pushed religion or spirituality on us, but she clearly had something different, and a kind of positivity, a kind of contentment, and a kind of patience with life that was very sustaining to everybody in the family, and sort of held things together.
And how wonderful that you got to benefit from having these different perspectives and pull them together in your own balance of having a a secular science-grounded approach to what you do for a living, and yet still having something that is personally uplifting that still ties in quite well with that context.
Yeah, I feel extremely lucky and extremely grateful. And in fact, for much of my, sort of journey and training and everything, I kept thinking, gee, I must be crazy because I'm trying to bring together these two worlds that, outside in the larger world seem just not to mix. And, I got messages in medical school that I should drop my empathy and that I should sort of certainly focus on, studying more facts and less philosophy. And at the same time, I would get messages from my Buddhist, community and friends that, I shouldn't I shouldn't mix it up with science and shouldn't turn it into psychology. That was somehow going to dilute it. And so, I think that what was amazing to me, honestly, was that it seemed like the world changed around me, and that it's sort of people in the larger world came around to the need to bring these two things, these two sides of us together again, and that wasn't just sort of an intellectual act. In fact, intellectual and academic world still in a way fights the need to bring these together, but people feel the need, and we all feel it as individuals, and so there's a huge hunger, in both in the sort of the medical community, the scientific community, and in the popular consciousness, to bring these things together. And even among my Buddhist colleagues, there's a real interest in, oh, you mean this could actually be practical? It could be,
right.
Oh, you mean you could, just to give you an example, when I was, as part of my sort of winding journey, I finally found a way to come back to study again in sort of my middle age with Bob Thurman at Columbia, because he had moved there and could now, I could now continue as sort of a graduate program. So I got a PhD in Buddhist studies with Bob. And in that context, I was always fascinated because I was working in the psychiatry department where, because of the changes in consciousness and culture, I was able to start sort of a Tibetan style, John Kabat-Zinn kind of mindfulness program called the Center for Meditation and Healing. And I could teach meditation, but I couldn't teach, sort of Buddhist ethics or Buddhist philosophy, which in the Buddhist world, as you know, are seen as indispensable wings to making the bird of meditation fly.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Meanwhile, in the religion department, I could teach ethics and I could teach philosophy, but I couldn't teach meditation because that became too, quote unquote, religious. And they were all concerned with maintaining a sense of, that we're scholars, we're scientific scholars of religion. We don't want to sort of, be subject to the embarrassing, charge that we might actually be, interested or need to sort of practice this in order to whatever, live or learn. So it's just ironic, and that's part of the reason why I founded the Nalanda Institute outside of the context where I do research at Columbia and Cornell. But I sort of opened it up as in the world, a sort of freestanding nonprofit community for learning, because I really felt that it was very hard given the various disciplinary skills and turfs and all the financial pressures of any single part of the academic world or the medical world, to create a real space where people could put all the pieces together without people sort of looking funny at them or looking over their shoulders, and could also have a kind of sense that this is good. It's not, questionable or strange, and we shouldn't, we don't need to be worried about it. We're practicing something that has its own sort of tried and true empirical tradition.
Yeah, it's interesting that Shinzen Young just today came out with a blog article inspired by the recent discovery and evidence for the Higgs boson, what they're calling the God particle.
Yes.
And he wrote a very nice piece, and he has a science background as well, that is indicative of us needing to keep some perspective around these things, that there happens to be alignment between these very disparate fields of spirituality and science. Doesn't mean that there's a causative relationship between the two. We need to be aware of that, and yet at the same time be able to say, well, that's pretty great that there is this alignment, and how can we maybe find some benefit and positively cherry pick ideas to build new and wonderful ways of living.
Yeah, I think that's so important, and I think one of the, I remember a conversation I had with His Holiness the Dalai Lama at a Columbia event, and he was talking about we were talking about the future of the Tibetan sciences and what contribution they could have to the world. And he was saying, Tibetan medicine is for the human body. The Tibetan psychology is for the mind. And these are the two great gifts of Tibetan culture. And I think that, in my experience, one of the things about Buddhist culture that is so appealing is that it involves a kind of first-person, yet also intersubjective and reproducible or empirical method to have a kind of what we might consider a spiritual science, or what we nowadays call a contemplative science. That is a way of bringing the kind of analytic discernment and objectivity, public objectivity, to our personal experience that you might normally only associate with the laboratory, but rather making each one of our minds and lives a laboratory where we're actually experimenting and learning how to live better in our own minds. And this kind of intersection is so important for all the stresses we face, the pressures for us to adapt to an ever-changing reality, to global realities, to interdependence, that, unless we find that the sort of the war or rift between science and religion in our culture has deprived us of the ingredients that we all need in our everyday life to really cope with those stresses that hit us very personally. So I think that's where we need something like a bridge between, and I agree with the comment that you made that doesn't mean that you can bring all things religious or all things scientific together somehow and mush them up and come up with something meaningful. And that makes it also part of the reason why we've tried to create a kind of middle ground by, in my work, structuring what I do as a sort of secular spiritual practice that's science-inspired, health-inspired. But I think the wonderful thing about the Buddhist tradition is that it's not so much of a stretch, that there is within the Buddhist tradition a long and robust, tradition, accepted practice of looking at contemplative living scientifically, that is, with critical reason, and approaching it as a healing and a practical endeavor, rather than thinking about it as, mythology or the answer to everything, or, the knowledge or control, in the scientific sense of every little thing, like the Higgs boson. From their point of view, the Buddha was always clear about the fact that, the foundation of his journey and of his teaching was the struggle with human suffering, with everyday human suffering.
Yeah, there's been some discussion around the idea of critical thought, and some suggestions have been made that in secular Buddhism we're not really being critical, and we need to remove critical from our guiding principles because we're not really doing it. We're accepting the Four Noble Truths on faith. And I have to come back to that and say that, well, as someone with a science background, as someone who is an out atheist and a skeptic, and yet sees the value of having a personal contemplative practice, please understand that when we use references like the Four Noble Truths, that's simply the context under which we've had them from a religious framework for thousands of years. It doesn't mean we've uncritically accepted them. It means that we've been curious about them. We tested them out. We continue to test them. We continue to question them. And we provisionally accept what they're saying based on experience, not just as an automatic fiat, well, because the Buddha said, that's true. No, we actually are engaging in this. And
that's very much within at least the Nalanda tradition, where we talk about this sort of the more scientific and more public or application-oriented, the part of the Buddhist tradition, the Mahayana tradition, that focused more on outreach to the community and bringing spiritual tools to a secular world. Nalanda was this great university that sort of served as the prototype or beacon of that approach. And within that, it's very clear that the reason that the right way, quote unquote, to rely on the Buddhist tradition and to use the Buddhist tradition is through critical inquiry and experiment, and that these other things of relying on tradition or the expertise of more experienced people are really only provisional until you can sort of validate it for yourself. So there is a fundamental experimental spirit in Buddhism that as Bob Thurman likes to say, the Buddha didn't want followers, he wanted other Buddhas.
Right.
He didn't want Buddhas, he wanted Buddhas. And that's the whole purpose of the system is it assumes in a very optimistic and sort of modern egalitarian or scientific kind of way that every human being can and must understand what makes things tick in their own happiness and unhappiness. And in fact, the tradition of the Noble Truths is that the Buddha's great gift is that he structured our relationship to happiness and unhappiness not as a personal sort of story quandary about why is God doing this to me, or why did nature give me this bum deal, but rather in terms of understanding causality, how things work, and how we, and by understanding the causality of suffering and the causality of happiness, we then are empowered to make a difference for ourselves. Interestingly, in that same conversation I had with the Dalai Lama, he talked about how, the scientific, the understanding of the Noble Truths, in his view, that the first two Noble Truths were scientific, that they were really about an analytic description of what life is like and what the world is like that doesn't really require anybody assuming any spiritual experience or reality whatsoever, and that it's only the latter truths that start with the Buddha's experience of healing or transcendence or whatever you want to call it, freedom, that he considers that to be contemplative or spiritual. So he split the Noble Truths right in half. He said half of them are scientific and half of them are spiritual. In my view, of course, these are just, it depends on how you slice and dice these categories, but clearly the Buddha, in fact, with that famous Goldsmith verse said, you really need to be critical. And that's part of the reason that, I wrote at the Nalanda Institute, we focus on not just giving people a little taste of this or that, but trying to reproduce the whole learning environment with all the disciplines that is learning, the three key disciplines of Buddhist learning: meditation, analytic, science or philosophy or wisdom. The analytic understanding is the second discipline, and the third one is sort of ethics or lifestyle. What's a good motivation? What's a good way to live? And so we want to bring those together, and we also want to not just give people, a taste here, a taste there, or just the diluted, watered-down version. For those, once people get interested, I think there's a real need for there to be an ongoing learning process. And we have, for example, our 4-year curriculum, which is what this book, Sustainable Happiness, is designed to support. It's really designed as a manual or textbook for our 4-year program that really covers all three disciplines they're essential to Buddhist learning or healing. And it covers all of the tools that gradually developed in the Nalanda tradition for making Buddhist spiritual experience or contemplative science accessible to people living in the everyday world.
Joe, tell us a little bit about the formation of the Nalanda Institute for Contemplative Science. For folks listening to the podcast, go to the website www.nalandascience.org is where you can find out more about what Joe's talking about here. But Joe, tell us how that started.
I was in California, looking for a more more receptive environment, because this was in the 80s and so on, before these things really came into the mainstream. But I wanted to come back to New York to study with Bob Thurman, and my psychiatry colleagues, needed a job, so I went to the psychiatry department, and they sort of, and I was shocked that things had changed so much since maybe 10 or 15 years before I'd been in New York, that now people really wanted, instead of having to hide my interest in Buddhism or contemplative science or meditation, they came to me and asked me, would you please start an institute? Would you please start a center? So I started the Center for Meditation and Healing, and eventually moved from Columbia Presbyterian, where it was based. It thrived. There was a huge hunger in New York at the time, and we eventually moved it to Cornell, to the Weill Cornell Medical School, simply because it provided a better research environment, because we wanted to start studying. That once we'd seen we have a system for integrating the Tibetan methods, into this public teaching for self-healing and personal growth. And we wanted to see, how well they worked. So, some colleagues at Cornell, Mary Charlson, and so on, at the Integrative Medicine Center, helped us out with a number of studies that showed that our approach was efficacious, and it was really accessible to a wide mainstream audience. But as I said at that point, I still was feeling that, this was all somewhat rarefied, and it wasn't really, the environment, wasn't ideal for the general public to come in and learn. So I started Nalanda Institute formally in 2005 or maybe 2004 as a small community of students who really wanted to sort of learn more seriously or in more of an ongoing way. Started in my office, gradually moved our classes to Tibet House, and that's really where we are now. And if we are a 501c3 and sort of a growing community with 1,000 or more people on our mailing list, and lots of programs every semester, so it's a vibrant community, and I think because of the this sort of really serious interest in ongoing learning, because there's so much going on in the world today to introduce people to sort of basic mindfulness, basic yoga, that we really felt like there was a real hunger for people to take the next step. And how do you sink your teeth and start doing the kind of critical learning that we're used to doing in college, like a college for happiness or a college for life living, is kind of the sort of spirit of the place. And it's really quite, when I first started teaching at Tibet House back in the 90s, a few people would come to class. Now, we have our evening meditations, or we have our fall and spring classes, or our 4-year program, and hundreds of people come.
It's great to see that there's an interest that continues to rise in this, and I hear that from the local Zen communities, that they just don't have enough space for everyone who's interested in a contemplative practice. So, Joe, we also want to take a moment and talk about your new book that just came out, Sustainable Happiness, The Mind Science of Well-Being, Altruism, and Inspiration. Tell us what prompted you to write that.
Right. Well, as I was saying, the hunger that I felt in my own life to sort of study this integration of contemplative learning and practice with science, Western science, psychology, and healing. And then really the growing hunger in the community at large in the world around me, and sort of the feeling that it was time for me to get this out of my own system in terms of really presenting in a clear and accessible way the whole range of different tools that developed within the Tibetan tradition. So, as I was saying about Nalanda, because it was focused on offering contemplative skills for lay people in the everyday world, the basic teachings of mindfulness and self-healing remain fairly similar to all the other Buddhist traditions. The basic traditions, the basic practice of self-healing and mindfulness were similar to the other Buddhist traditions, but there was much more of a focus on developing ways of engaging with a stressful world, with a competitive world, with sort of the distress of a community of people that wasn't necessarily a monastic community seeking happiness, but might have been people, very stressed out, and so they developed a sort of an expanded version of what nowadays we call loving kindness. I call it industrial strength loving kindness, which is usually called mind training. It's about learning to transform your normal social reactivity and the stress of social interactions into a positive, proactive, engagement with the world that's based on, wisdom and compassion, essentially. But again, there was an unfolding of even further techniques to speed the process of developing that new kind of self that's more mature, adult, engaged, ready to deal with the difficulties of life without the same struggle. And so using imagery, for example, what I call role modeling imagery, and using more advanced methods of controlling the nervous system, controlling energy and chemistry, they're developed this sort of tools of role modeling maturity quickly, role modeling altruism, or being a good parent to yourself and others, and also role modeling the art of really tapping into the blissful part of our nervous system and disarming and opening our nervous system and sort of changing our chemistry through meditation rather than through medication, right? And so in addition to the book is broken into 4 parts. The first one, which gives a Tibetan slant on mindfulness, the 4 Noble Truths, and then the second covers mind clearing, which is really a Tibetan take on loving kindness. The third and fourth really introduce, for the first time, I think, in an accessible, psychological, health and science-based way, introduce the techniques of visualization that I describe as role modeling imagery, and the techniques of advanced energy work or sublimation that I describe as sublimation practices or inspiration practices. And I think the whole idea is really to try to maintain the same level of evidence-based or scientific transparency that people like John Kabat-Zinn or Richie Davidson have offered us, but to really integrate some of these more seemingly religious kinds of practices, like visualizing deities, for example, or having aesthetic rituals of offering or things like that. And how could that be part of the same tradition? What's really going on there? So trying to make that psychology accessible and to relate it to the work of psychotherapy and the work of developing the brain and developing the social capacities of our nervous system. That's essentially what I wrote, Sustainable Happiness for.
In Dan Siegel's review, he talks about integration, and the term I've been using a lot lately is integrated contemplative practice to describe what it is that we do. Tell us more about what is meant by and the importance of integration as you see it?
Right. Well, a great word, and but also a great thing to have, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think the idea is the way our minds normally work and the way our nervous systems normally work is by, compartmentalizing. And think about how you would live if you had to sort of reinvent every day, how to get out the door, how to, cook breakfast. So a lot of the stuff that we do is based on, sort of autopilot conditioned learning that's happened at different points in our lives. And we're not really that aware of how it all fits together because we're not, we're mostly living in a certain degree of stress and fragmentation. But the whole idea of a contemplative way of living is that there's no need for the stress, really, that it's actually counterproductive and unnecessary. It's not biologically necessary because we can actually stop and employ this amazing capacity our nervous system has to integrate all of the things that it does with awareness and also the higher functions that Dan talks about being supported by the prefrontal cortex, sort of distinctively human part of our brains that involves sort of higher social capacities like empathy, morality, self-restraint, self-regulation, and so on. Really things that are important to our being able to adapt to an unnatural condition of life, which is mostly social and mostly cultural, and doesn't really involve very many saber-toothed tigers. So learning how to really integrate our whole nervous system into an engaged social mode. That's sort of the optimal, highest mode of functioning or engagement that I think we've really evolved for. Is really, I think, what sort of the highest sense or the most interesting sense to me of that word integration, although it can mean many things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, seeing that the practice is not just about what we do on the cushion, but how we socialize with others moment by moment, that's where the benefit of the practice really comes in. It's not just what's going on in your head, but it's also what happens as it manifests in those integrated interactions with others. Our guest today has been Dr. Joe Loizzo, director of the Nalanda Institute of Contemplative Science. We've also been talking about Joe's book, Sustainable Happiness, The Mind Science of Well-Being, Altruism, and Inspiration. The website for both of those, everyone listening, is nalandascience.org. And then for the book, sustainablehappinessbook.com. Joe, thank you very much for being here. I've really enjoyed hearing about what this approach has been and that nice balance and blending that you've done between, hard science approaches and still having a personal, contemplative, inspirational practice. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ted. Wonderful. I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation as well. Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.